The silk of her dress was a second skin, cool and unforgiving against the sudden, shocking heat of the asphalt. Rain slicked the Seoul street, turning the city lights into a blurry watercolor of reds and golds that swam in Lena's vision. One moment, she was standing in the marble foyer of her husband's penthouse. The next, she was kneeling on the pavement, the contents of her hastily packed designer duffel bag scattered around her like garbage. A single Louboutin lay on its side, its red sole a slash of defiance in the grime. Her husband, Jamin, stood on the curb, his handsome face twisted into a mask of contempt she had only ever seen him use on service staff. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was the other woman. She was younger, thinner, a perfect porcelain doll wrapped in a Chanel coat Lena knew for a fact had been delivered just last week. "Get out," Jamin had spat, his voice devoid of the honeyed warmth he used for the public, for the cameras. "You are an embarrassment. A stain on my name." He had thrown her out with nothing but the clothes on her back and what she could grab in 60 frantic seconds. Her phone, her wallet, and, in a moment of pure, unthinking instinct, a small, matte black external hard drive from his immaculate glass desk. She'd thought it contained photos, memories of the 2 years she'd wasted believing his lies. Now, it felt as heavy and useless as a stone in her palm. The doorman, who had bowed to her that very morning, averted his eyes. No one helped. No one dared. She was no longer Mrs. Park. She was just a foreigner, a discarded wife, her size and her skin making her an obstacle on the pristine Gangnam sidewalk. Lena gathered her things, her movements stiff with a cold fury that was rapidly replacing the shock. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the strap of her bag. She would not cry. Not here. Not for him. She straightened to her full height, ignoring the burn in her knees, and met his gaze one last time. The lack of remorse in his eyes was a physical blow. She turned and walked away, the click of her one remaining heel against the wet stone a lonely, defiant rhythm. She walked for blocks, the rain plastering her hair to her scalp, the single bare foot a testament to her humiliation. She needed to think, to find a hotel, to figure out what came next. Her life in Seoul, her entire world, had been tied to Jamin. He had isolated her, wrapping her in luxury so completely she hadn't realized it was a cage until the door slammed shut behind her. A prickle of awareness crawled up her spine, a feeling she'd learned to trust in the crowded city streets. It was different from the usual stares she received. This was predatory. She glanced over her shoulder. 2 men in dark, ill-fitting suits were keeping pace with her, their expressions flat and purposeful. They weren't police. They weren't random thugs. They moved with the clumsy confidence of men who were used to getting what they wanted through brute force. Jamin's dogs. He must have realized what she'd taken. The hard drive. It wasn't photos. It was something else. Something he wanted back. Badly. Panic, cold and sharp, finally lanced through her fury. She was alone, in a foreign country, with no one to call. Her survival instinct, honed by a life of being underestimated, took over. She ducked into a narrow alleyway, the smell of kimchi and damp concrete enveloping her. She ran. The alley opened into a labyrinth of smaller passages, a hidden circulatory system behind the glittering facade of the main street. Lena's breath came in ragged bursts, her lungs burning. The bare foot was a liability, slowing her down, but adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic. She could hear them behind her, their heavy footfalls echoing off the brick walls. They were clumsy, but persistent. She rounded a corner, her heart sinking as she met a dead end, a high, graffiti-covered wall. Trapped. The 2 men appeared at the entrance to the alley, blocking her only escape. They advanced slowly, savoring the moment. One of them cracked his knuckles, a sickeningly cliché sound that made her stomach clench. "The boss wants his property back," he grunted in heavily accented English. "Just give us the drive, and we can make this easy." Lena clutched her bag to her chest, her mind racing. There was no way out. She braced herself, ready to fight, to scream, to do anything but surrender. Just as they lunged, a sound cut through the rain-soaked air. It was not a siren. It was the low, purring growl of a powerful engine, impossibly close. A pair of headlights sliced through the darkness, pinning the two thugs in their glare. A black sedan, so sleek and polished it seemed to absorb the light around it, had materialized at the alley's mouth. It hadn't been there a second ago. The thugs froze, their bravado evaporating into genuine fear. The car was a statement of power they understood instinctively. The passenger door opened with a soft, expensive click. A man in a suit, his face obscured by shadow, gestured for her to get in. Not with a wave, but with a subtle, commanding tilt of his head. It was not a request. It was a summons. She looked from the terrified faces of Jamin's men to the silent, waiting car. One prison for another. She chose the one she didn't know. Lena ran past the frozen men and slid into the buttery leather seat. The door closed behind her with a sound like a vault ceiling shut, plunging the world outside into silence. The interior of the car was a sanctuary of quiet and calm. The scent of genuine leather mixed with a subtle, clean fragrance, something like cedar and expensive smoke. There was no music playing, only the faint, rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. The man beside her did not speak. He did not even look at her. He sat perfectly still, his posture immaculate, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked city passing by. He wore a suit of charcoal gray so exquisitely tailored it seemed molded to his frame. His hands rested on his knees, long-fingered and steady, one adorned with a simple, heavy silver ring. He was not handsome in the way Jamin was, with his polished, media-friendly perfection. This man's face was all sharp angles and severe lines, carved from something harder than stone. His eyes, when he finally turned his head, were dark and depthless, and they saw everything. They took in her disheveled state, the damp dress, the missing shoe, the defiant terror in her expression, without a flicker of judgment or pity. He was simply assessing, calculating. His presence was a physical weight in the small space, an absolute authority that needed no words to assert itself. The car moved with impossible smoothness through the snarled soul traffic, other vehicles seeming to melt out of its path. "My name is Kwon Tae-hyun," he said, his voice a low baritone, calm and measured. It held no warmth, only a chilling certainty. Lena recognized the name. Not from the society pages like Jamin's, but from hushed, fearful whispers. A name connected to shipping empires, construction firms, and the shadows that fell between them. A name people avoided saying aloud. He was the real power in this city, the kind Jamin only pretended to have. Taehyun's gaze dropped to the duffel bag clutched in her lap. "Your husband is a fool," he stated, not as an opinion but as an established fact. "He values the wrong things and makes enemies of the wrong people." His eyes lifted back to hers, and the question came, soft yet lethal. "What did you take from his office?" There was no accusation in his tone. It was a simple request for information, but the unspoken threat behind it was suffocating. He knew. He knew she had it, and he knew it mattered. Her old life was a smoking ruin behind her, and her new one was held in the hands of the most dangerous man in Seoul. The car passed through a set of immense, unmarked steel gates and swept up a long, winding drive. The home that emerged from the misty hillside was not a house, it was a fortress. A breathtaking structure of black steel, dark wood, and vast panes of glass, it clung to the mountain like a predator, surveying its domain. It was a monument to wealth and power, so immense it was utterly silent.
No taquis statues, no ostentatious fountains.
Just brutalist perfection and the quiet hum of absolute security. Inside, the silence was even more profound. The floors were polished concrete, the walls vast expanses of stone and glass revealing a panoramic, godlike view of the city lights below. Men in dark suits moved through the space with the silent efficiency of ghosts, their gazes never lingering on her, but she felt their awareness as a constant, low-level hum. Lena was escorted to a suite of rooms that was larger than the apartment she'd first shared with Jamin. It was furnished with minimalist, priceless pieces, a cavernous bathroom of black marble, and a closet already stocked with clothes in her size. Simple, elegant pieces in shades of gray, black, and cream. There was no lock on the door, but she knew with bone-deep certainty that she was a prisoner. A well-appointed one, but a prisoner nonetheless. Taehyun had taken the hard drive from her without a word of thanks. He'd simply held out his hand, his expression unreadable, and she had surrendered it. Now she was a loose end, a liability he had to manage. She tried to argue, her voice sounding small in the cavernous main hall. "You can't just keep me here. I haven't done anything." He had been examining a piece of ceramic art, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "Jaemin will not stop looking for you. Or for what you took. The men he sent tonight were amateurs. The next ones will not be." He finally faced her, his dark eyes pinning her in place. "You are not a guest here, Lena. You are a security risk. My security risk. As long as you are in this house, you are under my protection. Whether you want it or not is irrelevant." Days bled into one another. Lena existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost haunting the edges of Kwon Taehyun's world. He was a phantom himself, disappearing for long stretches, then reappearing without warning. He rarely spoke to her, his presence a silent, brooding storm cloud in the vast, sterile house. She learned his routines by observation. The early mornings in the gym, a brutal, disciplined ballet of violence against a punching bag. The late nights in his study, surrounded by screens displaying stock tickers and what looked like satellite surveillance feeds. She saw the way his lieutenants deferred to him, their bodies held in postures of rigid respect, their voices low and clipped. They called him boss, the English word sounding stark and absolute. He was the center of their universe, the sun around which they all orbited. One evening, she was curled in an armchair in the library, a space she'd claimed as her own, when she overheard two of his senior men talking in the hallway. Their voices were hushed, but the thick walls couldn't completely muffle their words. They were discussing a rival, a man named Choi, who was getting aggressive. "He's making the same moves as before," one of them said, his voice tight with anger. Just like with Sora, the other man cursed under his breath. "The boss will not let that happen again. He carries that failure every day." He trusted her, and Choi used that trust to put a knife in his back, Sora. The name hung in the air. A failure. A woman he trusted. It was a small crack in his marble facade, the first hint of a wound beneath the layers of tailored wool and cold indifference. A vulnerability. It didn't make him seem weaker. It made him seem infinitely more dangerous, a man motivated by something more potent than mere profit. It made him, for the first time, seem human. The attack came without warning. It was not the clumsy assault of Jaemin's thugs, but a surgical, professional strike. A security blind spot exploited. A silent entry. Lena was in the kitchen, a space she'd found comfort in, attempting to bake a batch of cookies from memory. The sudden, sharp crack of silenced gunfire was unmistakable. The staff, trained for this, vanished. An alarm, silent to her ears, must have blared through the house's internal systems. Before she could even process the sound, the kitchen doors burst open and Taehyun was there. He moved with a lethal grace that was terrifying to behold.
He didn't shout. He didn't panic.
He simply crossed the room in 2 long strides, grabbed her arm, and pulled her down behind the massive steel island. "Stay down. Don't move," he commanded, his voice a low growl next to her ear. His body was a wall of solid muscle, shielding her completely. The scent of his cologne, cedar and smoke, filled her senses, a strange anchor in the chaos. She could feel the heat of him, the tension coiled in his frame. His men were moving through the house, their responses a choreographed dance of violence. Lena, pinned between the cold steel of the island and the solid warmth of Taehyun's body, saw it. A flicker on one of the small security monitors near the pantry. A heat signature in the West Garden, a place the initial sweep had missed. An oversight. "There," she whispered, her voice tight. She pointed. The West Garden. By the retaining wall, Taehyun's eyes followed her finger. He didn't question her. He lifted a small radio to his lips, his gaze still locked on the screen. West Garden. 2 hostels. Terminate, there was a brief, tense silence, then two more muffled shots from outside. The immediate threat was over as quickly as it had begun. He didn't move away from her immediately. For a long second, they remained frozen, his body pressed against hers, the adrenaline of the moment a palpable current between them. He had saved her, but she had helped him. She hadn't frozen. She hadn't screamed. She had seen a detail he and his highly trained team had missed. When he finally pulled back, the way he looked at her had changed. The dismissal was gone, replaced by a flicker of something sharp and assessing. Something that looked almost like respect. In the unnerving quiet that followed the failed intrusion, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. The invisible barrier between Lena and Taehyun had become porous. He no longer looked through her. He looked at her. He started seeking her out, not for conversation, but for her presence. He would find her in the library and sit in the opposite armchair, working silently on his laptop. He would appear in the kitchen while she was stress baking and accept a freshly baked pastry with a curt nod that felt more meaningful than 1,000 words of praise. He started asking her questions. Not about her feelings, but about Jaemin. About his business practices, his associates, his vanities. She answered truthfully, her observations sharp and insightful. She had been a wife, but she had not been blind. She had seen the rot beneath the polished surface of her husband's life. One night, he summoned her to his study. The hard drive sat on the corner of his massive desk, a silent accusation. She had assumed he'd wiped it, destroyed it. But it was there. A test. Jaemin was laundering money for the Choi family, he said, his eyes fixed on her face, gauging her reaction. He was skimming from them. And from me. The drive contains proof of his transactions, he paused. It also contains records of my organization's early acquisitions.
Before my time.
Methods were less subtle then. He gestured for her to look at the screen. He had a file open. It was a list of shell corporations and holding companies. And there, near the bottom, was a name that made the air leave her lungs. A small textile import company that had gone bankrupt a decade ago. The company her father had poured his life into. The company whose collapse had broken him. Taehyun's empire had been built, in part, on the ashes of her family's security. He was showing her this. Deliberately. It was a truth that should have sent her running, a monstrous revelation of the chasm between their worlds. But as she looked at him, at the unflinching honesty in his dark eyes, she didn't feel fear. She felt a strange, terrifying clarity. He wasn't hiding his sins from her. He was showing her exactly who he was. The message came on a burner phone, one of the few concessions to outside contact Taehyun had allowed her. It was from an old university friend, begging to meet, claiming to have urgent news about Lena's family back home. It was a clumsy, obvious trap. Her friend would never contact her this way. It had Choi's desperation written all over it. They were tired of trying to breach the fortress. Now they were trying to lure the asset out. Lena showed the message to Taehyun. A muscle feathered in his jaw. They think you are stupid, he said, his voice dangerously soft. They think you are a weakness. My weakness. Before she could argue, he was moving, issuing quiet, rapid-fire commands to his men. A plan was forming, a countertrap. But something went wrong. The information they had on Choi's location was bad. The trap was not where they thought. It was closer. As Lena was being moved to a more secure part of the house, Choi's men ambushed them in the underground garage.
It was brutal and fast.
In the chaos of screeching tires and shattering glass, she was separated from Taehyun's guards. A hand clamped over her mouth, and she was dragged toward an idling van. For one heart-stopping second, she thought it was over. Then he was there. Taehyun himself. He moved through the firefight not like a man, but like a force of nature. He was not frantic. He was fury, cold, and focused. The men holding her fell, without a sound. He reached her side, his face a pale, stark mask in the dim light. His hand came up, not to grab her, but to gently cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek as his eyes scanned her for any injury. The relief that washed over his features was so profound, so nakedly vulnerable, it stole her breath. It was there for only a second before the mask of indifference slammed back down, but she had seen it. He had thought he'd lost her. In the armored car, speeding away from the scene, the silence was electric. "I told you not to leave the house," he finally said, his voice rough with the ragged edge of fear. It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession. Lena met his gaze, her own fear giving way to a cold, hard resolve. "Your enemies came for me because they think I'm your property," she said, her voice steady. "They're wrong. I'm your partner," she leaned forward. "That company. The one that belonged to my father. You owe me for that. Not money. A seat at your table. I know how to beat them. I know how Jamin thinks. I know how to burn his world to the ground." The annual gala for the Seoul Future Foundation was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar. It was also neutral ground, a place where even bitter rivals maintained a veneer of civility. Jamin would be there, preening for the cameras. Choi would be there, lurking in the shadows. It was the perfect stage for a final confrontation. Taehyun was against it. It was too public, too risky. But Lena was insistent. "Jamin is a narcissist," she explained, standing before him in his study, no longer a supplicant, but an equal. "His ego is his greatest weakness. He needs to be seen winning. He won't expect me to show up on your arm. He'll see it as the ultimate humiliation, and he'll get reckless." She had a plan, one that was both elegant and cruel. It preyed on every one of her ex-husband's vanities. Taehyun watched her, a slow, dangerous smile touching his lips for the first time. He agreed. When she walked into the grand ballroom on Kwon Taehyun's arm, a hush fell over the crowd. She wore a gown of deep crimson silk that clung to her curves, her hair swept up to reveal the elegant line of her neck. She was not the discarded, weeping wife. She was a queen. Jamin saw her, and his face paled, then flushed with a furious red. It was exactly as she'd predicted. She let Taehyun lead her to the dance floor, and as they moved to the music, she saw Jamin approaching his ally, Choi, his gestures frantic. He was falling for it. Later, Lena found Jamin alone on a terrace overlooking the Han River. "You look well, Lena," he sneered, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. For a woman who lives in a cage, she gave him a slow, pitying smile. "This cage has a much better view, Jamin. And the owner values loyalty. A concept you wouldn't understand." She let a flicker of false fear cross her face. "He's moving his assets tonight. A major transfer. If someone were to intercept it, it would ruin him." She whispered a location, a time, a set of codes. All false. All designed to lead him and Choi's men into a meticulously prepared trap, miles away from the real transaction. His eyes lit up with greed and vindictive glee. He believed her. He thought she was betraying Taehyun for him. He was, as Taehyun had said, a fool. She watched him hurry away to make the call, a puppet dancing on strings he couldn't even see. She had just signed his death warrant. She felt no remorse. Only a cold, clean satisfaction. Jamin and Choi's men walked into an empty warehouse, expecting to find armored trucks full of cash. Instead, they found Taehyun's entire enforcement division waiting for them. It was not a fight. It was a reckoning. By dawn, the Choi family was shattered, its leadership decapitated. Jamin, stripped of his allies and his wealth, simply disappeared. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, his name erased from the public record as if he had never existed. The city was quiet. The war was over. Lena stood by the vast window in Taehyun's study, watching the sun rise over a city that now belonged to him, completely and utterly. She heard him enter the room, his footsteps silent on the concrete floor. He came to stand beside her, not touching, but his presence was a solid, grounding force. The cost of her safety had been the complete annihilation of her past. She had crossed a line, done something morally absolute, and she could not go back. She had no regrets. "It's done," he said. It was a statement of fact, but also an acknowledgement of her role in the victory. She had been the architect. He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. The coldness was gone, replaced by something deep and unwavering. "This world does not give things freely. Everything has a price." Loyalty. Power. Safety. You have paid it, he looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the man behind the empire, the man who carried the weight of a past failure and who had just prevented a new one. My organization is built on a single principle: absolute loyalty. You have shown more of it in a few weeks than men who have sworn me their lives for decades. He moved to his desk and picked up a single, heavy object. It was an antique key, ornate and wrought from dark iron. He slid it across the polished surface of the desk. It came to a stop just before her fingers. "This house is yours," he said, his voice a low vibration in the silent room. "Not as my guest. Not as my prisoner." His gaze held hers, intense and possessive. "A claim." As its queen, Lena looked from the key to his face. There was no smile, no soft declaration. There was only the hard, unvarnished truth of what they had become to each other. Two survivors, two rulers, bound by danger and sealed by a choice. Her hand closed around the cool, heavy iron of the key. It felt like a scepter. It felt like a shackle. It felt like home.